Senator Paul.
Of course, Black lives do matter, but just saying it so doesn't make it so. Slogans painted in the street don't necessarily save lives. It's important to know that the majority of lives being lost in our cities are young Black men. I think it's unconscionable. It's been going on decade after decade after decade. I've visited the south side of Chicago. I've been to the most violent precinct in our country. I visited with Pastor Brooks there, who's trying to save lives one at a time through Christ, through counseling, through showing a strong male role model that is acting in a peaceful way. I've been to Ferguson. I was there after the riots. I met with the business owners there who lost their businesses, the majority of whom were African American. Pastor Brooks was recently interviewed, and after the rioting in Chicago, lamented that rioters burned down the local pharmacy, and now people in his community were having to drive 15, 20 miles out into the suburbs to get their prescription drugs. It's unconscionable. It's not an easy problem to fix. People have tried to fix it, but it's going on in our cities, and it's made worse by lawlessness. It's made worse by the mayhem that people have allowed. And there is an inconvenient truth that we have to face, and it's a political one. The inconvenient truth is that all of these cities are run by Democrats and have been for 50 years. Every one of our major cities run by Democrats, governors, mayors, police chiefs, all Democrats. Now, you could say it's a coincidence, or you could say, well, all of them? If you look at the murder rate, the top 10 cities that have the highest murder rate in our country, every one of the mayors is a Democrat. So we have to get to the bottom of this. And if you live in those cities, we have to figure out some kind of constructive way to make it better. But you have to first realize that the Democrats have failed every one of these cities. And if your city is under attack and you have young children being shot, the chairman mentioned the names of these young children. In Louisville, 2-year-olds, 5-year-olds being shot through windows and doors. Who's running the cities? We have to do something about it. But painting slogans and graffiti and throwing Molotov cocktails isn't getting you anywhere. If you live in Portland, instead of throwing Molotov cocktails, instead of trying to burn the federal courthouse, maybe you should be gathering signatures to have a recall of the mayor who let mayhem and chaos happen in the city. Maybe we should be recalling the mayor of Chicago who's allowed this to go on. It's been going on decade after decade. Black lives do matter. But if they do matter, do something about it. And those who are at the receiving end of this, the young Black men who are dying in Chicago, dying in these cities, rise up and say, my goodness, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again. Quit electing the people who are allowing your cities to go to rot and ruin, who are allowing the local drugstore to be burned down, who are allowing the businesses to be burned down that will leave the community and never come back. It is a disaster in our country, and people need to let the blame accrue where it will accrue to the people who've been running these cities for 50 years. With regard to who should do this, my preference is that it be done locally. The Constitution reserves these police powers to the state, and primarily the police powers should be exercised in the state. It should be a rare exception that we have federal officers in our states taking care of things, even as serious as arson, even as serious as attacks. But I do understand when there is mayhem and chaos, somebody's got to protect the federal buildings. My preference would be that if that has to happen, that they stay at the federal buildings, arresting only those who are committing violence when they commit the violence. And we are aware and careful that allowing federal police and allowing people to federalize police force and send it into our cities, that there are dangers to that. One of the checks and balances of federalism was not to let the executive branch have police, not to have the executive branch in our states. So I think we need to be very wary of the possibility for harm by federalizing police powers, sending them into these situations. And there have been some disasters already. Perhaps not your department, but the images of the young man being shot with a rubber bullet who had his skull fractured and his face fractured and maybe ultimately will be disfigured from this while he was simply holding up a speaker, those are terrible symbols. And it's hard to be a policeman. The federal authorities haven't necessarily been I think, steeped in the training that it takes to be able to try to put down violence, but at the same time, not get in the way of of peaceful protest. And we have to acknowledge, though, that this is a chaotic situation and it hasn't been peaceful protesting. So someone must do something. But I would say that the more constructive way of doing this would be to assess who are the officials, who are the political officials that run these cities, and how have they let us down. And it's time and time again, Democrats for 50 years running our cities and letting us down. And if you are, a family that lives on the south side of Chicago, you need to ask yourself, who's in charge of this city, and why aren't they doing something to protect my children? How come children are still being shot in Chicago? Who's doing it? Why are my local officials doing nothing? And the answer is, frankly, Democrats have done nothing for our cities for 50 years, and the people who live in our cities need to make a reassessment of who's been in charge of our cities. The only question I'd like to finish with would be the idea of police powers, and that police powers primarily should reside within the states and not the federal government. Do you have a comment on that?
Senator, I would say that, again, Federal Protective Service, through laws that Congress have passed, have given them specific authorities to protect federal facilities. Now, when we talk about everywhere else in the country outside of Portland, any arrests that need to be made because there are individuals perhaps targeting or committing violence against those federal facilities are usually done by state and local law enforcement. So I would agree with you. That's who needs to arrest these individuals and work with the U.S. Attorney to charge those individuals. Unfortunately, for 60 days in Portland, we did not see that occur. No one was holding these individuals accountable. Night after night, they would do their violent acts. No one would hold them accountable. So DHS was put into a position that we had to start making arrests. We had to hold these individuals accountable. As I indicated at the top, 99 federal arrests thus far in Portland. All of those have either taken place on federal property or within 1 to 2 to 3 blocks of that federal property. There seems to be a misconception that we're somehow, across the city, policing the city. That is not the case. We are only targeting individuals that we see, that we know, and that we track take, violent activities and criminal activities against that courthouse.
We will make America great again.